Rise by T. Snyder. Chapter 27. Growing Apart.
Derek Riggs, upstate Massachusetts, 2002. By the time I reached the fort, Matthew's bicycle was already parked outside of the entrance, tucked behind one of the camouflage tarps we had covered in leaves and twigs. But as I glanced behind it, I noticed that there was only one bike, which meant Sebastian had yet to arrive. I clenched my jaw in frustration and took one last glance around the forest for any sign of him or anyone else who might be around. Then I quickly squeezed through the cluttered mess of fallen trees and logs that we used to obscure the entranceway to the fort. As I emerged inside, pushing away one of the interior tarps, I made eye contact with Matthew, staring down the length of the shotgun he was pointing at my head. "Hey," I stated, nodding hello and moving past him as he lowered the gun, no longer concerned that I might be an intruder.
"Where's Seb?"
he asked, his voice spiking in the middle of his question, still changing from the mid-pubescent hormones pumping through his body. His face had a few big zits on it, and his hair was unkempt as usual. What I noticed most, however, was the determined, stern expression on his face, expecting answers to everything I'd suggested to him over the brief conversation we'd had on the phone. "Sebastian did this to me," I replied, unwrapping a bloody bandana from my head to reveal the gash Sebastian had ripped open across my head when he'd slammed me against the nozzle of one of the school's water fountains. So I broke his nose. Then he went to the school nurse, and I told him to meet us out here after he was done.
"The nurse?"
Matthew scoffed, embarrassed to hear what a pussy his brother had been. "Yeah, I know," I grunted, popping open a Tupperware container of medical supplies and digging out some cotton balls, sterile water, numbing gel, and a needle and thread. "Your brother's got a serious mommy complex," I continued, swiveling around to take a seat in front of a tiny mirror mounted on the wall.
"What happened?"
Matthew demanded, still uninformed of exactly what had caused the fight and what we were fighting about. I took a moment to rub some gel on my forehead after washing the wound, trying to decide if I would wait for Sebastian to arrive before his trial began.
"What happened?"
Matthew repeated, louder and more frantic than before. I glanced in the mirror at his expression and shook my head. "Your brother missed a meeting we arranged to comb the premises of the school before class started. And when I tried to confront him about it and insisted that we skip our first class so that we'd be able to get the lay of the land, he declined," I explained, sliding the needle into a thick chunk of flesh hanging off my forehead and slowly sewing it back on, not even flinching as I did so.
"What do you mean he declined?"
Something along the lines of not wanting to bother until after school. And when I got in his face about it, he said some shit like how I needed to learn to compromise.
"Compromise?"
Matthew asked, his tone subdued and concerned by what I had told him. "Yeah, compromise."
"Is that why you broke his nose?"
"No," I replied, finishing the first third of what I assumed would be 12 stitches stretching from the front to the side of my head. I broke his nose because when I mentioned how much of an asshole he was for turning his back on the protocols, he snapped and attacked me.
"That doesn't make any sense,"
Matthew eventually said, fighting against the truth of what I just told him.
"Seb wouldn't do that."
"That's what I thought too," I confessed, feeling a sudden pulse of hurt and rage shoot to the surface. "That backstabbing son of a bitch. But we can't waste time with what we want to believe. He's made up his mind, and I've made up mine. It's up to you now."
"What are you talking about?"
"The failsafe, Matt. I sighed, disgusted that our friendship had come to this. Remember? For if anyone ever decided to try and leave the group.
No fucking way.
Matt growled, tightly clenching the shotgun in his hands that he made a point of aiming at the dirt wall.
It can't be that bad. Seb was probably just nervous about his first day.
Nervous? Does this look like something that someone who's fucking nervous does? I yelled, standing up and showing off the gash in my head. It is that bad. And when he not only decided to try and compromise on the protocols, but actually has the audacity to come up with excuses for why we should too, then I'm sorry, Matt, but your brother's made up his fucking mind about turning his back on us. Matthew took a deep breath and held it, no doubt trying to come to any understanding he could that would account for his brother's betrayal. But as I looked at him struggle with the decision before us, I couldn't help but recognize a similar expression as the one he'd made the last few times Sebastian had failed to show up for drills on time or had canceled supply checks or scouting missions. The truth was that this decision was a long time coming, and both Matthew and myself just didn't want to believe that it could happen. That my best friend and his older brother would risk everything we had for his own stupid, selfish reasons. Matthew clenched his jaw in pensive conflict, and I turned to sit down and finish my stitches, not saying another word to each other for the full 10 minutes until we heard the sound of a bicycle approaching the entrance of the fort.
I'm not gonna kill my own brother, Derek,
Matthew stated, keeping his voice low so that Sebastian wouldn't overhear him. I glared at Matthew for a moment, listening to Sebastian tuck his bike behind the tarp out front.
We're just gonna have to talk about this.
Remember the protocols, Matthew? Remember why they're there?
I know, but the infection hasn't happened yet.
No, it hasn't. But when it does, if we're not ready in every single way and the protocols weren't maintained, then we're all dead. And I'll have no one but you and your fucking brother to thank for that, I exclaimed, turning my freshly stitched head to the side to see Sebastian enter the fort, his broken nose now bandaged and plugged.
Hey,
Sebastian muttered, glancing at me and quickly looking to greet his brother as well.
Why did you go to the nurse?
Matthew asked, shaking his head at the bandages on his brother's nose.
So I could get them to write me a note excusing me from class, he replied,
stepping between us to find a seat on the other side of the fort.
And what do you care? I've already plugged myself up enough times to know what to do when it happens to me or you guys anyway.
Tell him your side of the story, I interrupted, cutting through their little chat to try and get the trial underway, glaring angrily at Sebastian's nonchalant demeanor.
My side of the story?
Yeah, you asshole. Like why you attacked me, why you turned your back on the protocols, and why you should be the one who stays in the group rather than me.
Motherfucker, I will rip those goddamn stitches out of your head, Sebastian stated coldly. Hey, just tell your side of the story,
Matt interrupted, shotgun still in hand.
All right,
sure, Sebastian huffed, adjusting himself in his seat and pointing a finger at me.
I told Derek I wasn't going to do a sweep of the premises like we'd planned because we already knew the layout of the school. I mean, we played there when we were younger. We went out with our parents on election days, not to mention all the other times we'd already walked around it. But all he heard was that I didn't want to run around pretending to be fucking recon ninjas when we were supposed to be in class. Why do you attack him then?
Matthew asked, doing his best to try and remain impartial despite the magnitude of the decision before him.
Because he said that he needed to worry about whether or not being a pussy ran in our family, he explained,
watching as Matthew turned to look disapprovingly at me. Yeah, and I'm still worried about it, I replied, meeting Matthew's stare with cold determination, still unsure whether or not he'd have the balls to pull the trigger. Fuck you, Sebastian snapped. Shut up, Matthew insisted, rubbing his brow and shaking his head.
Seb, if all you had was outdated intelligence about the school, then Derek's right. You needed to do a sweep before going to class. The protocols don't allow for exceptions, even if you have other obligations.
Are you fucking kidding me? Sebastian yelled, rolling his eyes and curling his hands into fists.
Did he tell you to say that?
He continued, staring furiously at me. No, it's the protocols. We both told him that. Practically every day of his life, I screamed, enraged that Sebastian could even pretend not to understand the situation, that he had allowed himself to become such a pathetic, sniveling pussy, and that Matthew and I had to put up with it for as long as we had. The same protocols you swore to uphold, just like your brother and I are doing.
He didn't tell me to say anything, Seb. Now calm down. You two have got to be joking,
Sebastian groaned, pulling his hand down his face and shaking his head.
Are you seriously making this big of a deal out of this? Like fucking seriously? It's not just this,
Matthew exclaimed, saying what I was going to before I had the chance. I watched him, letting him speak, and hoping that he'd make the right decision.
You've been fucking up for months now, Seb. We just didn't want to believe it, and maybe you didn't either, but
what? Sebastian shouted, no longer upset with me. This was between him and his brother now.
I don't know if it's because Dad's been treating you worse than the dog since Mom died, or what. You've just changed. Everything about you is changing. It's called growing up. And when you grow up, you'll understand. No. I'll never be able to make excuses the way you do. I don't lie to myself, ever. This isn't a fucking game to us, and we're not playing around,
Matthew continued, measuring up to the hopes I'd had for him, a true soldier and a devoted friend. Sebastian's face went blank, his mouth dropping open out of shock that his younger brother would speak to him the way he was.
As far as I'm concerned, unless you pull your shit together right now, apologize for attacking Derek, and never, ever make excuses for getting out of the protocols again, well, then there's the door.
Sebastian didn't respond at first, even though I knew what his answer would be. And while the contingency protocol that we had come up with to prevent anyone from leaving the group without a bullet in his head likely wasn't going to be upheld, to be honest, I was relieved to just sit back and watch, finally able to calm down enough to see that even I couldn't bring myself to hurt Sebastian, despite all the grumbling I'd done about how it had to happen. Instead, what Matthew had said and the determination he'd shown was everything I needed, everything the group needed to stay together. And while Sebastian would, unfortunately, no longer be a part of that, at least I still had something. Matthew would stand by me until the end.
Matthew, think about what you're saying. Don't just do what Derek wants you to. I'm not. This is my decision. And despite what you think, I've been making my own decisions for a while now. I'm not a little kid anymore. If you do this,
Sebastian finally stated, cold, hurt, and so angry, screaming wouldn't do him justice.
If you seriously fucking do this, I will never speak to you again. Both of you. I know, his brother admitted, clearly at odds with the decision he'd made. That works both ways, I added, reassuring Sebastian that not only was his friendship with us over, but as far as we were concerned, for what he'd done, he was dead. And nothing, not even the infection itself, would change that.